a great pleasure to be here. I feel like I should make a small apology to Barry's students because they're using this book that I wrote called Economic Justice, and the publisher charges an outrageous amount of money for it.
No worries, Steve. They got used copies.
And there,
That's no royalties.
well, that's good. I get no royalties. That's okay. Anyway, so one of the things just about the title, what is economic justice? Sounds like a nice abstract philosophical question. How should we evaluate economic systems? So one of the things when I did work on this book, which was more or less the 1990s, I felt like I wanted to bring the philosophical issues closer to the form in which ordinary humans think about these matters. So I did try to incorporate, and I'll talk a little bit tonight, some thoughts about systems and not just abstract ideas, so to speak. Oops, wrong way. So let me just start off saying a couple of things about evaluating economic, and I call them economic/political systems because they're always integrated. I will mention one point of view that tries to separate them entirely, but I don't think that's actually possible. And then 2 points about doing evaluation. So because the focus is on economic justice, that suggests that what we're trying to evaluate is the degree to which systems or policies are just or unjust. But evaluations of economic systems and policies don't focus exclusively on moral kinds of issues. I'd say if you think about trying to evaluate an economic system, then at least it seems plausible to me that you need to think about, well, what is an economic system supposed to do? What are its functions? And as I see it, and I'm not an economist, I actually never have taken a course in economics, but say la vie. But it seems as if the two things that economies are supposed to do are to carry out production and distribution. That is, they're supposed to produce somehow or other the things that people need for some sort of decent life, to keep us alive at a minimum. And then somehow there's got to be part of the system has to distribute these things effectively. The most just system, if we could come up with, if we all agreed on a principle of justice and we were able to implement it, but the system, though perfectly just, was actually unsuccessful in terms of producing or distributing resources, then we would reject that. Might be perfectly just, but we wouldn't want to be members of that society, probably, or we wouldn't want to inflict it on other people. The other thing about evaluations, moral evaluations, and this came out, I think, last week a bit, is that the vocabulary, so to speak, of justice is not the only moral vocabulary. And so you can have many discussions by philosophers and other thinkers that don't use the word justice, but are still quite relevant. And the prime example that I thought I would put in a plug for here, how many people have heard of Peter Singer?
Lower that a little. You're feeding back a little. I mean, you may be a little too close.
Okay.
Usually that's not the problem, but...
Yeah? Okay. Okay, so Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher who's been teaching at Princeton for a number of years. There was Steve Forbes, I think, quit the Princeton board of whatever when Singer was hired. And he's an amazing philosopher and a very good, clear writer. So you might want to just, if you're looking for a philosopher to read who's readable and interesting, he'd be a good one. And this particular article, 1972, he was a graduate student at Oxford, and he wrote an article called Famine, Affluence, and Morality, which is really about global justice, but really makes all readers uncomfortable. Anybody who reads it fears that Singer is right, but hopes he's wrong. Anyway, I do recommend that. Whoops. Okay, I want to start with, I'm calling this kind of a litmus test for each of you to take for yourself. And the litmus test is how you respond to this particular quotation from a book by Thomas Nagel, a very excellent philosopher. And he says, "It is appalling that the most effective social systems we have been able to devise permit so many people to be born into conditions of harsh deprivation, which crush their prospects for leading a decent life, while many others are well provided for from birth and are free to enjoy advantages vastly beyond the conditions of mere decency." So Nagel seems to focus on two kinds of things. What I call levels of well-being. Some people at very low levels of well-being, others very, very high levels of well-being. And the reason for this is not anything that they've done, but actually has to do with their birth. So in terms of something we talked about last week, procedural justice, having a certain amount of resources because of your birth, who you were born to, or whatever condition you might have been born in, seems to go contrary to justice. So it's kind of a challenge from Nagel. But not everybody would agree with him about that. And in fact, what I want to do is to think about systems of capitalist economies, because there's a certain sense when Nagel talks about the kinds of systems that we now have, he's really talking about the systems of the United States, Europe, developed countries, which are very productive, have lots of resources, but also there tends to be a very sharp division between the status and levels of well-being of citizens in those countries. So he challenges that as an injustice. So I want to shift now to a view of capitalism, a belief in a capitalist economy, economic system, and some reasons that people give, some arguments that people give who support a capitalist system, even though it might have some of the features that Nagel has pointed out. So here's three kinds of arguments for capitalism. Capitalism is the most productive economic system, and it creates the highest levels of well-being. That's a widely held, widely made claim, shared by many people. Two, capitalism is the most just system because it gives people what they deserve. It rewards the most hardworking, productive people with greater amounts of economic resources. And three, capitalism protects and promotes liberty by preventing the government from depriving people of the economic rewards they've gained through their efforts and contributions to productivity. It also protects and promotes liberty because it allows people the freedom to engage in economic activities, to produce things, to start companies, and so on. And it allows people to buy the things that they want, even bottles of soda, which we had discussed first for Sandler last week. So now we have kind of a challenge to capitalist systems. We have some assertions by people who support it. And so I'm now going to try to see how we might investigate these claims on both sides. And the first thing we need actually is some kind of definition or clarification of what we mean by capitalism. It's a familiar word, but if we're going to actually evaluate it, we want to know, well, what are its properties. And second, since the claims on behalf of capitalism said that it was best or better than other systems, we need to know what the alternative systems are so that we can investigate them and try to make a comparison. And then finally, we need some criteria. We need some values or some principles that we can use, ideally, to investigate all of the systems. That is, if we could and this was my idea when I wrote my book years ago, that if I could find some values that were shared by people who were supporters of different systems, then at least I've got a starting point where if it could be shown that those values lead in the direction of supporting one system but not others, then if all of them have kind of agreed at the beginning that yes, these are the relevant values to use as criteria, then we might actually, make some progress and get some people to change their minds, or, reach some sort of consensus rather than the sort of polarized differences we tend to have now. Just a further note on the bottom here, more than one system can be just, right? So I'm going to investigate 3 systems and then actually increase that number. But if there are 3 systems, it's possible that they all work, right? And it's also possible that they could all be just. That could be one outcome. And so it might be a tie, right? The evaluation might be a tie, or it might be that, as I sort of anticipated, and since I was writing the book, I knew what the moral of the story was going to be, that one of the systems was going to be the winner. So this table, this chart here, actually represents, for the students who are reading the book, some of this will be familiar, it represents the structure of the book. So what I tried to do in the book was to focus on 3 different systems: capitalism, socialism, and the welfare state, and to evaluate them all by a criteria of maximizing well-being, kind of utilitarian criterion, rewarding desert, that is giving people or having a system so that the result is that people get what they deserve, and then finally one that protects and promotes liberty. And so in a certain way, rather than sticking with just the term justice and saying, oh gosh, which system is just, my question really turned into, oh, all right, if we want to know which kind of system is the most just, we have to find some other words, other terms to serve as criteria, and then we can try to think about, well, what would a just society look like? And my thought was a just society, if there were a society that maximized well-being, rewarded desert, and protected and promoted liberty, then whether or not we call that justice, that would be pretty good. And I don't think we'd want to debate about justice anymore if we had such a thing. So in the book, I try to give some very simple understandings, explanations of what these systems are. And in more recent years, I've actually been complicating this in my own mind and breaking them into different kinds of systems. There's different forms of these systems. And so one of the things I tried to do here was to keep it sort of simple enough that it really got at some main things, but that we didn't have our heads sort of spinning in complicated discussions of the nature of these things. So basically, I focus on 3 features. One has to do with ownership, the other with production and distribution, and finally, what I think of as the allocation of resources, who gets what. And so capitalism, I'm describing here as basically involving private ownership of property, whereas if you look at socialism next door there, it's public ownership of property, or certainly means of production, but again, for simplicity, public ownership of property is playing a very important role in socialist schemes. In capitalism, a market system of production and distribution. And what does that mean? It means that things are produced by people, by individuals or groups of people who decide to produce and try to sell some sorts of goods and services. And so they are going to produce them and they are going to market them, try to distribute them to people by getting getting customers to pay money for these things. And there's no central plan about what should be produced or how it should be distributed, but in a market system, people produce stuff in order to earn a living or, find ways of selling things that they can then use the profits from. And then it's up to consumers to decide whether they want to buy those particular products. So it's all very highly decentralized. If any of you are familiar with this famous notion from Adam Smith, the invisible hand, he talks very briefly, he actually only uses that word twice, but he talks about a system in which individuals trying to promote their own self-interest do that by producing goods that other people will want. So they profit, they help other people, they contribute to other people's well-being, but actually from a self-interested motive, or what Adam Smith called self-love. Not from benevolence. So he says the butcher, the brewer, the baker do not produce their stuff altruistically or out of benevolence, but they're trying to earn a living. But in doing so, they produce things of value for other people. And the economy as a whole, this capitalist market economy that Adam Smith had in mind, it works and it's driven, that is, lots and lots of people get the things that they need and want, but it's driven by actually each person, so to speak, looking out for themselves. So it's kind of an irony there. And so it's the visible hands are people trying to promote their own individual interests. The invisible hand is kind of the sum total of all these interactions, and it's beneficial to society as a whole. So that's what's supposed to be the virtues of the market system. In a socialist system, there would be a planned economy. There would be decisions about what things were needed, what were important, worthwhile to produce, and also then how they would be distributed to people. So that would be centralized decision-making, a visible hand. And then finally, this notion of, which is very central to justice, of what I think of as an allocation principle, that each system will have its own rule about how things get distributed to people. And this famous phrase, I mean, it's in Marx, the Communist Manifesto, though it predates Marx, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. And I'm sticking just with the to each one. So in a capitalist system, it's to each according to ability to pay. But not everything that we get is gotten through buying and selling. We sometimes receive gifts, right? So you get a birthday present or a holiday present. That's not according to ability to pay. It's according to ability, as opposed to generate love or affection in other people. So we have ability to pay plus gifts, and gifts, of course, are not only personal gifts like birthday presents, but they're also inheritances, which can have a fairly important role in things, and they're also charitable donations. So all those would come under gifts. In socialism, to each according, there are sort of variety of slogans used, but the most famous, to each according to need, or to each an equal share. So those are, we'll leave that sort of vague, but those are roughly the ideas. Now, it's interesting that in a lot of conversations, the welfare state is not even mentioned. And when I spoke here a couple of years ago, I think I had a quote from some students of mine whom I had asked to give a survey and to ask people what was capitalism, socialism, the welfare state. And a number of them came back saying nobody knew what the welfare state was, even though we live in a welfare state. But so basically, a welfare state is, I'll define it again later, but it's primarily private property with some government property. Actually, government owns quite a lot of stuff. It's a market system plus some government production, distribution of goods and services, and then the allocation principle to each according to their ability to pay, but also gifts, and a legal right to some resources. Depending on the type of welfare state, different things might be given. Food stamps might be such that people qualify, etc. So it's kind of a different system, and I'll talk about different versions of that a bit later. So here's kind of an interesting and influential idea in American culture. And this is a quote from Barack Obama's first press conference, February 2009. We were in very bad shape economically, it was a crisis, and he was not able to get the support he wanted for the policies he was promoting. And he said about his opponents, you have some people very sincere who philosophically just think the government has no business interfering in, the marketplace. So the people who think the government has no business interfering in the marketplace and see that and have this as a kind of philosophical conviction. I always love it when people use the word philosophy in context that suggests it's important. So I rather like this quote. But what we have here is a kind of something like the principle of church-state separation, where people think there's a principled reason why the government should stay out of religion and vice versa. Only here it's government and the marketplace. Robert Nozick, who we talked about last week a bit, Roman and I both, author of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which is a very, very important work, 1973, defending a minimal state version, or a minimal state form of government and a libertarian capitalist view, and I'll talk a little more about both of those. But here's part of his explanation. He says, a minimal state limited to the narrow functions of protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts, and so on, is justified, legitimate, as he says elsewhere. Any more extensive state, that is, any state that does more than those minimal things, will violate persons' rights not to do certain things. And then he says this he gives two examples of policies that are affected by his principle. The state may not use its coercive apparatus, really means taxation, for the purpose of getting some citizens to aid others. And basically what he's doing there is signaling that he's an opponent. He's going to argue in his book in such a way that he's trying to show that the welfare state, which does use tax money to provide benefits to people where they don't pay for them, but other people pay for them, and they're forced to pay for them, whether or not they would like to help these other people in need. So Nozick is an opponent of the welfare state, and he did a lot to raise, among philosophers, questions about the legitimacy of the welfare state. So Nozick is an advocate of the minimal state and of libertarian capitalism. And in my book, I actually, although I was uncomfortable with really how to define capitalism, I more or less had Nozick's view in mind. And since then, I've been sort of trying to come to terms with the fact that there are actually many forms of capitalism, that different thinkers have different forms of capitalism that they support. So the first one, the most radical, is anarcho-capitalism. And it actually is the one that you might say does the best of separating the market from government, because in an anarcho-capitalist system, it's a form of anarchism, so there is no government. And if there's no government, there's no government interference in the market. Okay? So in an anarcho-capitalist system, there would be a pure market, there'd be no government services, and things would get distributed according to the ability to create, to pay, and to receive as gifts. Nozick's view, the minimal state, and he's not the only one who supports this, would have a market and government, and there would be government services, namely protection from force and fraud. So the police and the army are the sort of basic, paradigmatic institutions in a minimal state. And of course, along with them, you do, if you're going to have police, you're going to need courts, you're going to need maybe prisons or other kinds of people to do enforcement. Now, one of the things I've learned, though this is an old copy of this book, Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom, which was written around 1960 from lectures that he gave in the 1950s. And this was really the heyday of the welfare state, or approaching the Johnson years, if you want to think of that as the real heyday. So Milton Friedman was kind of on the outside here. And he defended capitalism in this book. And it's a very, I disagree with lots in it, but it's a very good book. And he actually describes two different forms of capitalism I think are worth thinking of. One, this is his term, the umpire state, where in addition to protecting people from force and fraud, government acts as an economic rule maker, an umpire, a defender, and protector of property rights. That actually, for Friedman, the government plays a very important role in keeping the market system going. That unlike Adam Smith and the notion that the invisible hand takes care of everything, that everything automatically works out, Friedman doesn't believe that. The market system needs help. It needs, for example, to define what property is, how and what would be a proper transfer from one person to another. He thinks has to or plays a role in preventing monopolies, which the system won't do by itself, and so on. So there's a lot of things that the state does that go beyond the minimal state that are aimed at sort of helping the economy along, because Friedman didn't think it could do everything by itself. Now, beyond that, Friedman, and so here he's representing two views, defends what I call pragmatic capitalism. So you've got the umpire state, but then you've also got the government providing some social benefits. So for example, in Nozick's minimal state, he never says this, but there's no government-supported education. He never talks about education. If he did and said that he didn't support any of it, his book might have seemed less plausible to many people. But in any case, Friedman does support education. And although he has some weird views about parks, he does support some local parks and protection from negative externalities, that is, indirect harms on people that are generated by the transactions or activities of other people. So there's kind of a spectrum here, and there's actually, as I'll show, a world of difference between these views, and yet they're all put forward by people who are identified as advocates of capitalism. So there's actually a lot of disagreement among advocates of capitalism. Here's a quote from Friedman. "Our principles offer no hard and fast line how far it is appropriate to use government to accomplish justly what is difficult or impossible to accomplish separately through strictly voluntary exchange. In any particular case of proposed intervention, we must make up a balance sheet listing the advantages and disadvantages." So you can see how, in a way, unrigid, how pragmatic Friedman is, unlike Nozick or other people. He's not going to just have a rigid principle and say, whatever happens, we're going to hold on to this. For an example of a defender of a rigid thinker, this is actually a very interesting point. So Murray Rothbard was an important advocate of anarcho-capitalism, anarchist capitalism. In 1973, in this book, it's pre-Nozick, but it could have came out the same year. It could have been directed to Nozick. If it is legitimate for the state to coerce the taxpayer into financing the police, Why is it not equally legitimate to coerce the taxpayer for many other activities, including building steel factories, subsidizing favorite groups, etc.? In other words, this is actually a very powerful question challenge, that he thinks that once you go from anarchism and you concede that you can have the government support police and an army with taxation, that then you've given away the show, that you've accepted a principle that if people think that an activity is valuable enough, then the government can do it. And so you've sort of lost the whole thing. So Rothbard's view is either be an anarchist capitalist and be, shall we say, pure and consistent, or you don't really have any serious principles. And although I think that's an exaggeration, the quote from Milton Friedman suggests that once you start, being flexible, it's not clear where and how you draw the lines. Okay, let me try to speed up a bit here, and I'll probably skip some things. So let's come to the welfare state then. Just focus on the first bit here. So what is a welfare state? So I'm calling a welfare state a market economy in which some production and distribution of goods and services are partly carried out by the government. Okay, so not a pure market system, but government involvement in some production, some distribution. And there are two kinds of arguments that I'll mention for the welfare state. One, so remember we have three values: well-being and desert, and then freedom, which I won't get to. So there's this notion economists use of diminishing marginal utility, that if you take a bunch of items, so suppose that in my book I use the example of an apple. If I have a single apple and I'm sort of hungry and I eat the apple, it has a pretty high value for me in that setting. If there's a second apple, I may still enjoy it a lot, but maybe I wouldn't value it as much as I valued the first one when I was really, really, really hungry. A third apple would be less valuable to me. The fourth, even less. We might even get to the point where it becomes negatively valuable. It would make me sick. I can't do it. I just throw them away, let them rot. And so the general idea with respect to money and other kinds of goods is that if you wanted to have a society in which you maximize well-being, and too much, so to speak, of a certain resource is concentrated in small groups of people, then they are not getting as much well-being generated. They're not getting as much good generated by these resources than you would get if they were distributed differently. So if you took the top 1% or whatever, taxed them and distributed money to lower income people, the lower income people could get a lot more benefit from that money than the very, very wealthy people are getting with it. And so if you were trying to have a society in which you maximize well-being, you can get a higher number, more udals or hedons, as they're sometimes called, than by having them concentrated just among some people. So the welfare state then, one of the aims of the welfare state is to move away from the results of a pure market to, so to speak, correct the market by distributing things so as to raise the level of well-being. And so on well-being, they would challenge people who are defenders of capitalism. Might even say that although capitalism, this is what Marx and Engels said, though capitalism is a great, great system for producing things, it's a lousy system for distributing them, because too many people don't get the goods. What about the idea of desert, which is a very powerful idea? Many, many, many people believe that capitalism is a good system because people work hard, and the ones who work hard are the most, contribute the most, get the most money and other goods, and people who don't contribute or don't work, they come out less well, but that's perfectly okay. there are a lot of problems with desert as a criterion. One is the problem of measuring desert. How do we tell? In other words, we've got this notion, so we've gone from justice to desert, and now how do we tell what we're looking for to decide how much a person deserves? Two things often mentioned are effort and contributions. That is not sort of how much good you do, effort or hard work. There are two problems there. One is that those things are very hard to measure. The other is that, you know, we know that lots of people who work very, very, very hard, long hours, hard labor, shall we say, actually are in very low paying jobs. And so it certainly isn't the case that if we wanted to go by desert, we wouldn't have the allocations that we do have. The second really important thing is that much wealth and income is undeserved because it's not the fruits of labor, but the fruits of luck, as in inheritances. So people don't work for inheritances in general. They are born into them, and they haven't put any work or effort into receiving them. They're just next of kin or whatever, or they're named. So Milton Friedman, if I had more time, I would read you a little bit from here, because Friedman actually, in his chapter 10 on the distribution of income, makes the claim at the start, or makes a claim that sounds very much like a desert hard work claim. So you think, okay, he thinks people should get what they deserve. But actually, as you get a few pages into the chapter, A, he's defending inheritance, and B, he actually says that with respect to pretty much everybody, luck plays a huge role, and luck is honestly undeserved. There's also, with respect to getting, resources from work, you do have to get jobs and this sort of thing. You have to get an education, and there are procedural injustices. So one of the things, if we think that a fair justice system would give everybody, there'd be an equal playing field, level playing field, everybody would compete sort of with the same odds. We know we don't have that kind of procedural justice, and in fact you can't in a capitalist system, because people, once you've won the game some, you now have additional resources that you can use to invest in other activities, and you'll have a better chance of being a winner. People who lose in the game initially are going to have fewer resources, maybe in debt, etc. The example that I use in the book is, if you think about playing Monopoly. I'm playing with my 70-year-old granddaughter who beat me the other day. But if you imagine, so in Monopoly, at the beginning of the game, everybody gets $1,500. Nobody has any properties to begin with. Imagine playing a series of Monopoly games where you started the new game where the old one left off. Somebody's already got boardwalk with a hotel. Somebody else, etc. You get the idea. So once you have the accumulation of resources, the level playing field, if it ever existed, is gone forever. I want to recommend another book. This is really shameless because Malcolm Gladwell is such a successful author. He doesn't really need plugs, but his book, Outliers, published 2008, is about the causes of success and failure. He says success, but success and failure. And it's an excellent book with great, great examples of the ways in which luck works for and against people in life. And I do highly recommend it. Let me just finish up with one other comment, and then maybe we'll talk about types of welfare states later. One of the things that's often left out when people talk about desert is that there are really, as I would say, two different kinds of desert. There's what I would call earned desert, the kind that's mostly talked about. You know, you work, you've succeeded, and therefore you deserve X, Y, or Z. The other, which doesn't really quite have a name, but I call human desert, that there are certain things, certain kinds of treatments, certain resources that people deserve simply because they are human beings. There is this slogan by the Gates Foundation, you probably heard it, and I always try to remember and forget, but something about how, you know, they're working hard because everybody deserves a chance for kind of a good life or something like that. So deserving a chance for a good life is not something you have to earn. So if there is such a kind of desert, or you might say people have a right to that kind of thing, then that would be something that people could deserve independently of whatever labor they've done. And one idea about the welfare state is that it tries to give people resources that they might be unable to get in the market, but that they would still deserve as human beings and as citizens. Thanks.
That is a perfect introduction to what I want to do. And I didn't conspire with Steve before this. But as I said, I want to play devil's advocate now. And what I'm going to do is pick up where Steve left off and look at the economic arguments that Milton Friedman actually makes. I teach a course in which I look at three paradigms. A whole course just has three economists. Milton Friedman, John Kenneth Galbraith, the Harvard liberal who died about a few months after Milton did a couple years ago, and Karl Marx. But for now, I want to take a look at the economics of Milton Friedman and convince you that he's actually right. Okay? So he starts out his book, which helped win him the Nobel Prize, by saying, I'm an economist, but the thing that is most paramount is political freedom, individual political freedom. But he says that in order to have political freedom, you must have economic freedom. An example he would have used in the 60s during the Cold War is, since you had no economic freedom in communist Russia, the Soviet Union, there could not be political freedom. So he sees economic freedom as the basis for political freedom. And therefore he comes to some conclusions such as Social Security violates economic and personal freedom by forcing individuals to delay current consumption for future consumption. But he went further and suggested something that was actually accurate in the 1960s, that Social Security was the most racist law in America. And the reason for that was that in the 1960s, the lifespan of white people was about 10 years longer than the lifespan of black people. So both black people and white people had to put in an equal amount during their lives, but white people got to enjoy the benefits of that Social Security for 10 years longer on average. So not only did it deny people the freedom to not save for their future, social engineering, but it was downright racist. Okay? Friedrich Hayek, who we haven't mentioned so far, kind of takes this view that once you abandon economic freedom, you're on the road to serfdom. And that the alternative, as Steve pointed out, is the idea of voluntary exchange. And he says specifically, when you create a society in which economics is based on voluntary exchange, that is the precise hallmark of what he calls the good society. Okay? And I'm going to look at that. And what provides voluntary exchange? A free private enterprise exchange economy, which we often call capitalism. Okay? So what are the goals? Let's go back and ask the question, what would be the goals of a good society? It says one is full employment. Everybody who wants to work should be able to work. I think we'd all agree. A second is that it would be good to have a society in which there's rapid economic growth. That's not so much, that's not only true here in the United States, it's certainly true in the developing world where people are poor. So you'd want full employment, rapid economic growth. You'd like to have relatively stable prices or greater affordability. Wouldn't it be nice to have full employment, rapid economic growth, and little or no inflation? And you wouldn't want to have discrimination on the basis of race or gender or sexual preference. And he says, here's a model that gives us all of those things. Here is a model of an economy that gives us all of those. Full employment, rapid growth, stable prices, and no discrimination. And he comes up with a model which has a series of assumptions. The first is perfect competition. And what he means by that is in every single market, there are many buyers and many sellers. Many buyers, many sellers. And that means that no seller has the monopoly advantage to set the price at whatever they want. There's so many sellers, they're competing with each other, which tends to drive the price down. The second assumption is perfect mobility. If you have your income or capital, you can choose to invest in Ford or General Motors or invest in whatever. Or if you're a worker, you have a choice to move from one employer to another employer, or if you want, you can move from Massachusetts to Florida to seek your fortune. And the third is perfect information. That in order to take advantage of competition and mobility, individuals need to have enough information to make rational choices. Right? So I need to know what the price of what the product is in Market Basket versus Star. I need to know what the wage will be if I go to work for employer A or employer B. The fourth assumption is that firms maximize profit, and that it's their only goal. In fact, in a fascinating article that he wrote, he said any firm that is philanthropic should be the first target of an antitrust suit, because the only firms that could be making profit are ones that have some kind of monopoly advantage. Because in a perfectly competitive market, there's always downward pressure on prices and downward pressure on profits. Fourth, the consumers always maximize utility. They're always trying to do what's good for themselves. Hard to disagree with that. In his extreme model, he says there are no externalities in production. That means, for example, if we burn a lot of coal, it doesn't matter. Or if somebody decides to produce a product which has some kind of externality affecting some other person, well, we kind of assume that away. Later on, he will adjust that assumption and talk about the need for some kind of environmental protection. No externalities in consumption. That is, you get in a crowded elevator, your cigarette smoke doesn't affect anybody else. That's obviously not true. But he says, in the perfect model that he's laying out, we don't worry about externalities. Again, he'll come back and fix that. And then finally, one that's a little odd, but very important, and that is, he says, tastes are exogenous. And what he means by that is that everybody's demand, everybody's desire is based on their own considerations. Another way to put this, which is kind of interesting, is they're not really influenced by advertising. They actually make decisions about wanting to buy this product rather than this product, this service rather than this service, based on their own rational thinking without undue pressure. One example, he talks about how what happens when government intervenes and screws this all up is when we have a minimum wage. And his argument is that in a perfectly competitive market, supply and demand equilibrate at full employment. But if you now put in a minimum wage, as you'll see here in the diagram, which is above the equilibrium, you're going to get more supply, that's the yellow, than demand, and you're going to therefore create unemployment. You'll have people who would be very pleased to work at $7 an hour, but the minimum wage is $8.25, and no employer will hire them at $8.25 because they don't think they're worth more than $7. And so the worker is actually harmed by the minimum wage because they would prefer to work at $7 an hour than not work at all. The firm would prefer to hire them at $7 an hour, but can't either afford or refuses to do it 8.25. And therefore, the first time you get government intervention in, let's say, a minimum wage, and I would assume that many of you in the room probably support the minimum wage, you're messing up the whole market and causing harm not only to the firm, but more importantly, to the worker. Here is a basic diagram that is fundamental economics. We have a competitive market where the price is price one. That's the price set in the market. And the firm has an average total cost curve that looks like this, which says that as it produces more and more output for a while, its cost drops as fixed cost is distributed over more and more products. Think about an auto industry, builds a big $1 billion factory. If it produces just one car, the car costs $1 billion. If you produce two, it's $500 million. If you produce 1 million, the fixed cost goes down to $1,000 per vehicle. And then you get higher and higher variable costs as you produce more and more. You either have to hire workers and pay them overtime, or your machinery has to be replaced and so forth. So what happens, right? You get to a point where you have the minimum cost output. That's the line that says that is the absolute minimum cost. Anything below that, the firm loses money. Because if that were the price, the minimum output, that would just be enough to cover their costs. If the price is above the minimum cost output, they're making profit. That's the difference between the blue line and the red line. They're charging a price higher than their minimum cost, right? And if you were a monopolist, you could do that. You could decide to set that price there because there's no competition, and you'd set the price above your cost, and you'd make a lot of money. General Motors used to do that. In 1955, General Motors was the largest corporation in the world, and its revenue was greater than the entire GDP of Belgium, the 18th richest country in the world. Okay? So you get this profit by having your price above your cost. But what happens when you have real competition? Somebody else comes into the market and says, I'll produce exactly the same product, and I'll lower my price to price 2. Now, if you have perfect information, the products are identical, and you can get it for P2, price 2 here, and price 1 here, everybody rushes away from firm 1 to firm 2, right? The price drops, the profit drops, and now firm 2 is making all the money, and firm 1, unless it drops its price, is out of business. Okay? And that keeps going. And you get more and more firms coming in, so we get to the point where the price drops to cost. Right? And the only time that anybody gets any advantage is if they produce a slightly better product, and for a very short period of time, people take the higher price but higher quality product until somebody else competes with them. And in a perfectly competitive market, there are obviously thousands and thousands of firms that can come into the market. By the way, the reason we have patents and licenses is to provide a longer period of time in which a company can make a profit so as to induce them to invest in new technology and new products. But we limit the length of patents. We limit the length of licenses. So what that does is it drives this price down. But it also encourages companies to come up with even more productive ways of producing the product, to lower the cost still further, to here the average total cost 2. And so this encourages growth, it encourages investment, it encourages better products at lower prices. How wonderful. Okay? And that will continue to drive the price down for better and better products. What about discrimination? Let's say we have two firms providing exactly the same good, but the firm on your right only hires blonde, blue-eyed, white guys. Okay? They hate anybody else. They don't hire women. They don't hire anybody of color. Firm 2 provides the same product, but they don't care who they hire. So you've got all the white men, blonde, blue-eyed white men, plus women, plus blacks, plus Hispanics, plus Asians, plus everyone else. Their supply of labor is going to be much higher, and as a result, they will be able to pay a lower wage. Because you got this big supply of people, not just this little supply of those blonde, blue-eyed white men. And therefore, their wages will be lower, their wage costs will be lower, and that means they can also charge a lower price. As such, discrimination is impossible. The firm that discriminates goes out of business. So what do we got? We got an economic system that is going to give us full employment. If you intervene in that labor market, you get unemployment through a minimum wage or a union or something like that, government-sponsored union. You get stable prices, if not falling prices. You got incentives to grow the economy with better and better products, better and better processes, and you eliminate discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sexual preference. What else could you want in an economy, right? So, if you believe in that system, what kinds of things do you oppose? And he has a list of 21 things that he opposes. The first is parity price support for agriculture, which was started during the New Deal, where basically you have the government supporting prices. What does that mean? It means mothers have to pay more for milk for their kids in order to help farmers who might be millionaires. So why would we have an agricultural support program that actually penalizes the consumer to make farmers even richer? It opposes all forms of tariffs on imports. Why shouldn't you be able to buy a better car made in Japan than a lousy car made by Ford, where I used to work? Right? So eliminate tariffs. It hurts GM, but it's good for the consumer. And after all, aren't we in favor of consumers? Every time we put on a tariff, we boost the price and force people to pay a higher price for a product that they could get cheaper without the tariff. Same thing for rationing. The government used to ration petroleum, it used to ration other things. Again, it raises the price. Got farmers to plow under their fields rather than to put more wheat on the market. It certainly opposes rent control. We think that rent control is good for people, but we know from some evidence that if you control rents, one, developers don't build more housing, and number two, owners of rental apartments let them deteriorate. Why would you want to have a policy which hurts the renter? We already pointed out why minimum wage laws are atrocious. Detailed regulation of industry, again, often captured by the industry itself, supports the industry against the consumer, such as the control of radio and TV by the FCC. This is before we had internet and everything else, which made some of these controls irrelevant. Social Security, as I pointed out, the most racist law in the books. Occupational licensing, such as, for example, doctors. He's against that. And he says the reason why he's against it is occupational licensing restricts the number of people who can go into a profession. And if you restrict the supply in the profession, you automatically increase the price. So, why shouldn't everybody be able to practice medicine? Right? Now he says the answer, and presumably the reason you're laughing, is you don't want me performing brain surgery, right? But let's say we did have some government regulation that he'd favor, and it has to do with perfect information. So that everybody who wants to perform brain surgery has to put out, their shingle. So I put out my shingle over here. Barry Bluestone, qualifications, PhD in economics, right? All right? And I'm pretty good at slicing up salami. And here's a doctor who actually went to Harvard Medical School, was a surgical resident for 6 years, and as a matter of fact has performed 2,723 brain surgeries and has a 98% satisfactory outcome. By the way, I have to put down my outcomes, and they're not zero, but they're more like 3 or 4%, or maybe they're 10%. But here's the difference. That doctor's going to charge $20,000. I do it for $9.99. Okay? It's your choice, right? You have a choice based on your perfect information to go with the brain surgeon, but you're going to be out $20,000, which means you're not going to be able to buy that new Ford Fusion, or you can go with me, take a bit of a risk, and buy a new car. He's opposed to public housing. And if we looked at public housing in the 1960s, we were blowing the buildings up because they became prisons for people. He was opposed to food stamps. He was opposed to the military draft during the Vietnam War. He's opposed to national parks. He thinks they should be privatized. He's opposed to the post office. He thinks, and this is before FedEx, that private business could do it much more profitably and much more efficiently and more cheaply. He's opposed to publicly owned and operated toll roads. He thinks those should be privatized. The Mass Pike should be sold off. Indiana has a few privately owned. He's opposed to public schools. Okay? So, what's his argument here? It turns out he actually has a soft heart. He's against public housing, he's against food stamps, he's against public schools. But what he actually supported was a negative income tax. That people who are poor should actually get cash from the government, which they can use to buy whatever they want. If they want to put it into food, they can do that. If they want to put it into housing, they can do that. And for public schools, he was against public schools. What he favored was a universal voucher system. Everybody would get a voucher for paying for school, but then you could choose to take it to a private school, a parochial school, a charter school, a pilot school. The idea was the individual should be given the right to choose what's best for them. But he realized that people had different incomes, different abilities to make income, and he didn't think that people should die just because they were poor. Okay? What did he favor? Well, unrestricted farm production to drive down the price of milk, free trade to drive down consumer prices, a price system that to decide who gets to own what goods and services, competitive housing market to increase housing supply and improve housing quality. He'd get rid of a lot of zoning laws that stop people from being able, developers from building housing. A free labor market without minimum wages or coercive unions. No specific regulation of industry except to protect individual safety, health safety. No regulation of radio and TV. He was in favor of private pension programs rather than Social Security. You should be able to get TIAA, Kraft, or Fidelity rather than have to go into the Social Security system. Free entry into any occupation to increase professional supply and drive down price. Negative income tax, a voluntary army. If you really want to have army, pay them enough to get people to volunteer. Private parks like Disney World, FedEx and UPS, private toll roads, education vouchers. So, what does this mean for economic justice in concluding? Economic justice exists when there are unfettered markets, little government intervention, and each individual and every company pursues its self-interest. Second of all, minimum taxation for critical public goods, national defense, local police, public schools, and to pay for the negative income tax. And individuals who make their living fair and square, not illegally, should be able to keep the income they earn, doing so without a confiscatory taxation. He favors a small proportional income tax to pay for the services of government, such as defense, such as police, and to pay for the small redistribution of income and to pay for educational vouchers. Government should be kept to a minimum. He's not an anarchist by a long shot. By the way, his son, who was a physicist, was an anarchist. And this is economic justice. His son, when I first came to Boston College in 1971, so we're talking 43 years ago, the university economics department invited his son to come to campus. And they asked me if I would debate him, because I was teaching a course on his dad's work. And this kid was a true anarchist. And he gave the anarchist argument like Rothbard, or pretty much like Nozick. And finally I turned to him and I said, "What do you think about stop signs?" And his answer was, "I'm against them." I said, "Well, people drive around. How do we do that?" He says, "Well, more aggressive drivers will get the right of way. And then if we set that up that way, over time, people will learn to drive defensively. They'll learn to be more careful. And then he said, they'll drive like everybody else does in Boston. Thank you.